Welcome back to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified, where we like to break down complex legal topics into bite-sized pieces for better understanding. Today we're going international. We're diving deep into the world of international dispute resolution with a fascinating concept called good offices.
It's a method that's often overlooked, but trust me, it plays a vital role in maintaining peace and stability on the global stage.
So imagine this. Two countries locked in a tense standoff, maybe even on the brink of conflict. Enter the good offices of a third party.
Stepping in
To try to de-escalate tensions and prevent things from spiraling out of control.
It's not quite mediation where the third party actively participates in negotiations, and it's not as formal as a court proceeding.
Right.
Good offices are all about creating the right conditions for the disputing parties to communicate, negotiate, and hopefully find their own path to resolution.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit.
Sure.
Could you define good offices for us and maybe walk us through some historical examples to illustrate how it's been used in the past?
Absolutely. At its core, good offices is a diplomatic process where a third party, be it a country, an international organization, or even a respected individual, facilitates communication and interaction between two parties in a dispute. Think of it as a diplomatic bridge helping to connect parties who might not be on speaking terms.
Interesting. So it's about creating a space for dialogue,
Yes.
but without imposing solutions.
Exactly. Now, to understand how this concept has evolved, let's take a quick trip back in time. Even in ancient Greece, we see examples of prominent figures like Pericles using their influence to bring warring city-states to the negotiating table. They weren't judges or arbitrators. They were facilitators creating the opportunity for peace.
That's a great example of how the concept has been around for centuries, even before formal international legal frameworks. So how did good offices become formalized in international law? Were there specific events or agreements that solidified its role in dispute resolution?
Well, one of the most significant milestones was the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907. These conventions were groundbreaking in promoting peaceful settlement of international disputes. They helped solidify the idea that third parties could play a valuable role in preventing conflicts from escalating.
And of course, we can't talk about international law without mentioning the United Nations.
Right.
How do good offices fit within the UN framework?
Okay.
Is it explicitly mentioned in the UN Charter?
That's where things get a bit interesting.
Oh.
While Article 33 of the UN Charter explicitly mentions mediation and conciliation as methods for peaceful settlement of disputes, it doesn't specifically name good offices.
Wait, so this crucial document that governs international relations
Yeah.
doesn't even mention good offices. That seems like a pretty big oversight, especially considering its long history and widespread use.
It might seem odd, but here's the key. Even though it's not explicitly mentioned, it's widely accepted that good offices fall under the umbrella of other peaceful means encouraged by the Charter. This actually provides a lot of flexibility, allowing countries and organizations to adapt their approach to the unique circumstances of each dispute.
So it's like a hidden superpower within the UN framework. Not explicitly stated, but a powerful tool nonetheless.
Exactly.
But with terms like mediation and conciliation being mentioned specifically, are there clear distinctions between these methods and good offices?
Yeah.
Where do the lines blur and where are they clearly drawn?
You've hit on a crucial point. International relations often involve nuanced terminology, and it's important to understand the subtle differences between these approaches. Let's start with mediation.
Okay, so if good offices is about facilitating communication, how does mediation differ?
Mediation involves a more active role for the third party. The mediator doesn't just bring the parties together, they participate in the negotiations, offer suggestions, and try to find common ground. Think of it as a guided conversation where the mediator acts as a neutral facilitator.
So with mediation, there's a greater emphasis on finding solutions, whereas good offices is more about creating the conditions for the parties themselves to reach a solution.
Precisely.
Okay.
Now let's compare good offices to conciliation.
Right.
Conciliation is a more formal process, often involving an investigation into the facts of the dispute and the formulation of non-binding recommendations for a settlement.
So conciliation is like taking the dispute to an expert who reviews the evidence. Hears both sides and offers suggestions, but ultimately the parties are still free to accept or reject those suggestions.
Exactly. It combines elements of fact-finding, mediation, and legal analysis, but without the binding nature of a court judgment.
It's fascinating to see how these different approaches offer a range of options for addressing international disputes.
Yeah.
It's clear that the choice of which method to employ is crucial.
Yeah.
So how do countries decide which path to take? And what are some of the key factors they consider when deciding whether to offer or accept good offices?
Choosing the right approach is a strategic decision influenced by various factors. The nature of the dispute itself is crucial. Is it a border disagreement, a resource conflict, or a complex political clash?
So a minor territorial dispute might be more amenable to good offices than a long-standing conflict rooted in historical grievances or ideological differences.
Precisely. The intensity of the dispute, the level of trust between the parties, and the perceived neutrality of the potential third party all come into play.
Speaking of neutrality, it makes me think about the role of power dynamics in international relations.
Mm-hmm.
Does the power balance between the disputing countries or the third party influence the effectiveness of good offices?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, would it be more challenging if a powerful country offered good offices in a dispute involving a much weaker nation?
That's a perceptive observation. Power dynamics definitely play a role.
Yeah.
Ideally, the third party should be perceived as impartial and unbiased. If there's a significant power imbalance, it can create perceptions of pressure or coercion, which can undermine the process.
That makes sense. If one side feels like they're being forced into a solution, it's unlikely to be a sustainable or peaceful outcome.
Exactly. And this brings us to a crucial aspect of good offices, the principle of consent.
Mhm.
For good offices to be effective, both parties must willingly agree to the process.
Okay.
No one is forced into it.
So good offices is all about creating a space for dialogue,
Yes.
but only if the parties involved are genuinely open to that dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about strong-arming anyone into a solution.
You've got it.
Okay.
It's about respecting sovereignty and empowering states to find their own path to resolution.
This is all incredibly insightful, but I'm a show-me, don't-tell-me kind of learner.
I understand.
I need to see these concepts in action. Can we dive into some real-world examples of how good offices has played out in international disputes?
Of course.
Cases where it's been successful and perhaps instances where it's faced challenges.
Absolutely. There's no shortage of fascinating case studies that demonstrate both the potential and the limitations of good offices. Let's start with a case that highlights how good offices can be crucial, even after a legal ruling.
Okay.
The maritime boundary dispute between Cameroon and Nigeria over the Bakassi Peninsula is a prime example.
This case went all the way to the International Court of Justice, right? What role did good offices play after a court had already made a decision?
That's right. The ICJ ruled in favor of Cameroon in 2002,
Mm-hmm.
but the decision created tensions and potential for conflict.
Right.
To ensure a peaceful implementation of the ruling and prevent the dispute from reigniting.
It's a good reminder that international law isn't always about winning and losing in court.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's about finding ways to make those rulings work in the real world, to bridge the gap between legal pronouncements and practical realities.
couldn't have said it better myself. And
Yeah.
speaking of bridging gaps, another compelling case is the Malaysia-Indonesia confrontation from 1963 to 1966.
Okay.
This dispute stemmed from the formation of Malaysia, which Indonesia initially opposed.
I vaguely remember reading about this. Things got pretty heated, didn't they?
Absolutely.
Oh.
But Thailand, recognizing the potential for a regional crisis, stepped in to offer its good offices.
Mm.
Through careful diplomacy and shuttle diplomacy, they facilitated talks between the leaders of Malaysia and Indonesia, ultimately leading to the Bangkok Agreement, which paved the way for a peaceful resolution.
So Thailand acted as a regional peacemaker, using its good offices to bring two potentially hostile neighbors back from the brink of conflict.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that this case also highlights the ripple effect of good offices. The resolution of the Malaysia-Indonesia confrontation was a key factor in the formation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Right.
It shows how resolving one conflict can contribute to a broader architecture of peace and cooperation.
That's a great point. It underscores how these seemingly isolated acts of diplomacy can have far-reaching consequences, shaping the geopolitical landscape for years to come. Now, I'm curious, can you give us an example of good offices being used in a situation where resources, rather than territory, were at the heart of the conflict?
Absolutely. The Indus Waters Treaty dispute between India and Pakistan is a classic case of a resource conflict where good offices played a pivotal role. This long-standing dispute arose from the sharing of water resources from the Indus River system, a vital lifeline for both countries.
This is a region with a history of conflict and mistrust. So how did good offices help to bridge that divide?
The World Bank, surprisingly enough, played a key role in this case.
Interesting.
They provided good offices, facilitating negotiations and bringing their technical expertise to the table.
Right.
This helped to depoliticize the issue, focusing on finding practical solutions for water sharing.
The World Bank.
Hmm.
I usually associate them with finance and development.
Mm-hmm.
It's not international peacemaking. It's interesting to see how their expertise and resources can be leveraged in unexpected ways.
Exactly. It demonstrates that good offices can come from various sources and that even institutions not traditionally associated with conflict resolution can play a vital role in fostering peace.
Hmm.
Now, for another compelling example, let's shift our focus to the Pacific and look at the Bougainville conflict, a secessionist struggle within Papua New Guinea.
This conflict involved a long and bloody struggle for independence, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah.
And New Zealand played a crucial role in providing good offices facilitating dialogue between the warring factions. Their efforts helped to create a space for negotiations, ultimately leading to a peace agreement and a referendum on Bougainville's future.
So even smaller countries, without the same geopolitical clout as major powers, can play a significant role in international peacemaking through good offices.
Absolutely. It highlights the idea that any country with the right diplomatic skills and a commitment to peace can make a difference.
This has been an incredibly insightful discussion so far. We've explored the definition of good offices, its historical roots, its distinction from other dispute resolution methods, and even delved into some compelling case studies.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more about the inner workings of this diplomatic tool. Can we unpack the step-by-step process of good offices
Yeah.
and delve into the key principles that make it effective?
Of course. Understanding the process and the principles behind good offices is crucial for appreciating its potential and its limitations.
Right.
So let's shift our focus to those aspects in our next segment. Welcome back, law students.
Picking up where we left off, we're diving deeper into good offices, a method that can be instrumental in de-escalating international conflicts.
And as promised, we'll break down the actual process step by step so you can really grasp how it works in the real world.
Because let's face it, international law can sometimes feel abstract, but good offices is all about practical action, taking concrete steps to facilitate communication and build bridges between disputing parties.
Exactly. It's about rolling up your sleeves and finding ways to get those parties on the road to a solution. So let's walk through a hypothetical scenario. Imagine two countries, we'll call them Alpha and Bravo, are locked in a dispute over a shared waterway, a situation ripe for tension.
A classic source of conflict water is essential. When it's scarce, things can get heated quickly. So what's the first step in bringing good offices into play?
Well, you need a third party. This could be another country, an international organization, or even a respected individual. Think of it as casting for a crucial diplomatic role.
Right.
The right third party needs certain qualities to be effective.
So someone who is both respected and neutral.
Yes.
If Alpha and Bravo both see country Charlie as a fair player, Charlie could be a good fit.
Exactly. Charlie needs to be perceived as impartial, someone genuinely interested in helping, not pushing their own agenda.
It's all about trust. Without it, good offices is a non-starter. So let's say Charlie steps up and offers their good offices. What happens next?
Next, you need to get Alpha and Bravo on board. Charlie approaches both sides and says, "Hey, I think I can help. Are you open to talking?" It's important to remember that good offices is entirely consensual.
That makes sense. It's not about forcing anyone to do anything. It's about creating the space for dialogue, but only if all involved want to have that dialogue.
Now, assuming Alpha and Bravo agree, Charlie's next move is to facilitate communication.
Okay.
This could involve carrying messages between them, setting up a hotline, or even arranging a face-to-face meeting in a neutral location.
So Charlie becomes the go-between, making sure both sides are heard.
Exactly. Charlie's role is to build bridges and create an environment where real dialogue can happen.
Right.
Remember, Charlie is not there to impose a solution just to make it possible for Alpha and Bravo to find their own way out of the conflict.
It's about empowering them to take ownership of the process. Once communication is established, what can Charlie do to make those talks productive? It's one thing to get Alpha and Bravo in a room together, but quite another to ensure they make progress.
Excellent point. This is where the art of diplomacy comes in. Charlie might suggest an agenda for talks, identify common ground, and even propose confidence-building measures to reduce tensions.
Okay, I'm curious. What do confidence-building measures look like in practice?
They can take many forms.
Mhm.
In a dispute over water usage, Charlie might suggest Alpha and Bravo agree to a temporary mutual reduction in consumption as a show of good faith.
Okay.
Or they might propose a joint project to study the waterway and gather data fostering cooperation toward a shared goal.
I see. It's about finding ways to dial down the tension and create a more cooperative atmosphere, shifting the focus from confrontation to collaboration.
Exactly.
So-
Sometimes Charlie might need to get even more creative.
Uh-huh.
For example, in the Indus Waters Treaty dispute between India and Pakistan, the World Bank's good offices went beyond facilitating dialogue.
Right.
They also provided technical expertise on water management, helping to depoliticize the issue and enabling data-driven solutions.
That's a great example of how good offices can be tailored to the specific circumstances of a conflict. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. It requires flexibility and the ability to adapt to the unique needs of each situation.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, the goal remains the same, to empower the parties to find their own path to a lasting resolution.
So Charlie's role is multifaceted, diplomat, mediator, facilitator, and sometimes even subject matter expert. It's a pretty demanding job.
It certainly is, and that's why choosing the right third party is so important.
Yeah.
They need the skills, experience, and credibility to navigate these complex situations.
Okay, so let's say through Charlie's skillful facilitation, Alpha and Bravo manage to hammer out an agreement. What happens then? Does Charlie take a victory lap?
Well, Charlie can definitely breathe a sigh of relief.
Right.
But remember, their role is primarily to support the process, not take credit for the outcome. It's ultimately up to Alpha and Bravo to implement the agreement they reach.
So Charlie's like a proud parent watching their kids graduate.
Yes.
Happy to have played a role, but recognizing it's the kids' own hard work that got them there.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And just like a proud parent, Charlie might stay involved to help with implementation, monitor progress, and offer support along the way, ensuring the peace holds.
That makes sense. You don't just drop the mic and walk away once an agreement is signed. So we've explored the process.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the guiding principles that make good offices effective?
Right.
What are the non-negotiables that make this method tick?
You've hit upon the core of what makes good offices work.
Go.
Let's delve into those key principles in detail.
Great. Lay it on us.
First and foremost is impartiality. We've touched upon it, but it's so crucial.
Uh-huh.
The third party absolutely must be perceived as unbiased.
No playing favorites then.
Exactly.
Okay.
If Charlie leans toward Alpha or Bravo, it undermines the entire process. It erodes trust and makes it much harder to find common ground.
It's like a judge who's clearly biased toward one side in a trial. It throws the entire process into question.
Precisely. Another key principle is consent, which, as we discussed, is fundamental to good offices.
Right.
Alpha and Bravo must voluntarily agree to the process without coercion.
So respecting their sovereignty and their right to choose how they want to resolve the conflict is paramount.
Absolutely. It's about empowering them, not dictating to them.
Right.
And alongside consent comes non-coercion. Charlie cannot pressure or bully Alpha and Bravo into accepting a particular solution.
So no threats or ultimatums.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Good offices is about persuasion, facilitation, and finding solutions that work for everyone involved. It's not about imposing one side's rule upon the other.
It's about respecting their agency, allowing them to make their own choices, even if those choices aren't what Charlie thinks is best. It seems like trust and respect are at the heart of this whole process.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to another crucial principle: confidentiality. This allows for more open and honest dialogue as Alpha and Bravo can speak freely, explore options, and even brainstorm creative solutions without fear of their words being splashed across headlines.
Confidentiality creates a safe space, allowing those involved to let their guard down without worrying about political fallout or public opinion.
Precisely.
Okay.
It can be especially vital in conflicts involving sensitive issues or deep-seated historical grievances.
So we've got impartiality, consent, non-coercion, and confidentiality. What else should we add to the list of good offices essentials?
Last but certainly not least is good faith.
Okay.
All parties, including the third party, need to approach good offices with a genuine desire to find a peaceful solution. If one side is just going through the motions or trying to buy time, the process is unlikely to be successful.
It's like going to couples therapy when one person is already checked out of the relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's not going to work.
You need everyone to be fully invested in the process to have a chance of success.
So these principles, impartiality, consent, non-coercion, confidentiality, and good faith, are the foundation of good offices. They're what distinguish it from more adversarial methods of dispute resolution.
Precisely. They are not merely theoretical, they have real-world implications for how good offices is practiced and how effective it can be.
Actions speak louder than words.
Right, exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, where does good offices fit within the broader landscape of dispute resolution methods?
I can
How does it compare to other approaches like mediation, conciliation, or even arbitration and judicial settlement?
We've touched on this a bit, but I think it's worth exploring deeper.
Yeah,
How do these various approaches differ, and what are their strengths and weaknesses?
it's an excellent question. Understanding these distinctions is key to knowing when and how to apply different methods effectively.
Hmm.
Let's start by revisiting mediation, which involves a more active role for the third party than good offices.
Right. So if good offices is about getting those involved to talk, mediation is about helping them find solutions once they're at the table.
Exactly. The mediator actively participates in the negotiation, proposes possible solutions, and helps bridge the gap between the two sides.
Okay.
It's a more hands-on approach.
So going back to our hypothetical scenario in mediation, Charlie would not only bring Alpha and Bravo together,
Mm,
but also actively try to help them find a compromise on, say, how much water each country can use.
precisely. A mediator is more actively involved in shaping the outcome than a provider of good offices.
Okay. Mediation might be a good option if Alpha and Bravo are willing to talk, but need some help navigating the complexities of negotiation.
Absolutely. It can be very effective in breaking deadlocks and finding solutions that meet both sides' needs.
Now, what about conciliation? I remember you described it as a more formal process involving investigation and recommendations.
Yes, a conciliator is often appointed to delve into the dispute, gather facts, and even propose terms of settlement. It's more structured than mediation, often involving established procedures and timelines.
So if mediation is like having a referee in a boxing match,
Mm-hmm.
conciliation is like having a judge who will review the evidence and offer a non-binding opinion on how to resolve the case.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
Conciliation can bring clarity and structure to complex disputes.
So if Alpha and Bravo can't find common ground, even with mediation, conciliation might be a good option to bring in an expert who can offer a more objective perspective.
Exactly. Now let's compare good offices to more formal legal processes like arbitration and judicial settlement.
Okay.
These methods involve a third party making a binding decision that the disputing parties must abide by.
So with arbitration, Alpha and Bravo would agree to let a panel of experts make a decision about how the waterway should be shared.
Mm-hmm.
And in judicial settlement, they'd go to an international court and let a judge make the call.
Precisely. These are more adversarial processes with a clear winner and loser.
And that outcome could potentially make it more difficult to preserve relationships or move forward peacefully, particularly if one side feels they didn't receive a fair hearing.
You're absolutely right.
Mhm.
Which is why good offices is often seen as a more amicable approach, especially if preserving diplomatic relations is a priority.
So good offices could be a good first step in resolving a conflict.
Yes.
If it works, great.
Exactly.
If not, those more formal options are always available.
Good offices is often a stepping stone towards more structured negotiations or even legal proceedings.
It can help set the stage for a more durable peace, allowing parties to build trust and establish a foundation for future cooperation. This has been a really helpful breakdown of the different methods.
Yeah.
But how do countries decide which approach to take?
Mm-hmm.
What factors come into play when deciding whether to offer or accept good offices?
It's a complex decision-making process.
Yep.
But there are key considerations that can guide the choice. First and foremost is understanding the nature of the dispute itself. What's at stake? How deep are the divisions?
So a minor border disagreement might be easier to resolve through good offices than a long-standing conflict with deep emotional baggage.
Exactly.
Okay.
Complexity and intensity of the dispute will play a big role in determining which approach is most appropriate.
What other factors should be considered?
The relationship between the disputing parties is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
If they have a history of cooperation and dialogue, good offices might be a good fit.
Okay.
But if there's a lot of mistrust and animosity, it might be necessary to go straight to a more structured process.
It's a bit like deciding whether to try couples counseling or head straight for divorce court.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, it depends on the state of the relationship.
Another crucial factor is the willingness of both sides to compromise.
Right.
If they're entrenched in their positions and refuse to budge, even the best good offices won't be effective.
You need a certain level of flexibility and a genuine desire to find common ground for good offices to work.
Exactly.
Yeah, it can't force a solution if the parties aren't willing to meet each other halfway.
Precisely. Finally, it's essential to consider the resources and expertise of the potential third party. Do they have the diplomatic clout, the technical knowledge, and the financial resources to effectively facilitate dialogue and support a resolution?
So it's not just about finding someone who's neutral and respected. They also need to have the capacity to really make a difference.
Exactly. Choosing the right third party is crucial to the success of good offices. Now, with a deeper understanding of when and how to use good offices, let's explore the role of international organizations.
Right, we've mainly focused on individual countries providing good offices, but we know that organizations like the UN and the World Bank can also play a significant role. How does their involvement change the dynamics?
Ah, that's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
International organizations bring a unique set of strengths and challenges to the table.
So what are some of the advantages they offer?
Well, for starters, they often have a higher degree of legitimacy and impartiality than individual countries.
Yeah.
They're seen as less likely to be biased toward one side or the other.
So it's a bit like having a neutral referee rather than one who might secretly be rooting for their home team.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They can also bring a wealth of experience and expertise to the table, having dealt with countless conflicts and developed sophisticated mechanisms for facilitating dialogue.
It's like having a whole team of seasoned diplomats and mediators at your disposal, rather than just one person.
Precisely. International organizations also have access to significant resources, financial, logistical, and even technical.
Hmm.
This can be crucial for supporting negotiations, providing humanitarian assistance, and helping with the implementation of peace agreements.
So they can not only help facilitate dialogue,
Mm,
but they can also provide the practical support needed to make peace a reality.
exactly.
But are there also potential downsides to having international organizations involved in good offices?
You're right. I imagine there are some challenges that come with their involvement as well.
Ah,
One potential issue is bureaucracy. International organizations can be slow-moving and risk-averse, which can be frustrating for parties who are eager to see quick progress.
so it's a bit like trying to turn a giant ship.
Yeah.
It takes time and effort to get it moving in the right direction.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Another challenge is that international organizations can sometimes lack the deep understanding of local contexts that individual countries might have.
So it's important for them to work closely with regional countries to ensure their efforts are sensitive to local dynamics and cultural nuances. They need to be careful not to impose a solution that works on paper, but fails to consider the realities on the ground.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
And finally, international organizations are sometimes criticized for being too detached from the human impact of conflict, prioritizing their own institutional interests.
That makes me think about the importance of centering the voices of those most affected by the conflict. It's not just about states and institutions, it's about people's lives and livelihoods.
I couldn't agree more. It's crucial to prioritize finding solutions that bring real peace and stability to the people who are bearing the brunt of the conflict.
So it seems like international organizations can be powerful forces for peace, but their involvement also comes with certain challenges.
You've summed it up perfectly. And this discussion highlights an important point.
Mm-hmm.
Good offices isn't a static concept.
Okay.
It's constantly evolving alongside a changing world.
What do you mean by that? How are the dynamics of good offices shifting in the 21st century?
Well, think about the types of conflicts we see today.
Hmm.
We're increasingly dealing with complex, multifaceted disputes involving issues like climate change, cybersecurity, even pandemics.
Conflicts that don't neatly fit into traditional categories.
Exactly. And these new types of conflicts often require new approaches to good offices.
So how do we adapt good offices to meet the challenges of this increasingly complex world?
That's the million-dollar question,
Uh-huh.
and it's one that experts are grappling with right now.
So no easy answers.
Not yet. But there are promising ideas emerging.
Hmm.
For example, there's a growing recognition that good offices needs to be more inclusive, involving a wider range of actors like civil society organizations, women's groups, and youth representatives.
So it's about moving beyond the traditional state-centric model of diplomacy and recognizing that peace building is a multi-stakeholder process.
Precisely.
Okay.
We also see an increasing emphasis on using technology to facilitate dialogue and build trust.
Hmm.
Virtual platforms can potentially host peace talks, share information, and even connect people across conflict lines.
It's about leveraging the power of technology for peace.
Exactly. And finally, there's a growing understanding that good offices needs to be more focused on prevention, identifying, and addressing the root causes of conflict before they escalate into violence.
It's not just about putting out fires, it's about preventing them from starting in the first place.
You're right. And that requires a long-term perspective and a commitment to investing in peace-building efforts. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive into good offices, I want to leave you with a provocative question to ponder.
Okay.
We've talked about the importance of impartiality, but what if it's impossible? What if the third party has a vested interest in the conflict's outcome?
That's a challenging scenario, but a realistic one.
Exactly.
I imagine it happens more often than we'd like to admit.
So, how do we navigate these situations? Can good offices still be effective if the third party isn't entirely neutral? It's something to think about as we continue exploring this fascinating concept in part 3.
Welcome back to LexTalks, ready to wrap up our deep dive into good offices.
Absolutely. And I'm eager to pick up on that thought-provoking question. We left you with the dilemma of what happens when the third party offering good offices isn't completely neutral.
Right, that whole issue of hidden agendas and ulterior motives, does it automatically mean their efforts are doomed to fail?
It's certainly a tricky situation, and honestly, it's more common than we might think. Countries rarely operate in a purely altruistic way. There are almost always underlying interests at play.
So even when a country offers to help, they might have strategic goals, economic interests, or political alliances subtly influencing their actions.
Precisely. They might be trying to increase their regional influence, secure access to resources, or even just score points with an ally.
So it's not necessarily about actively sabotaging the peace process, but more about tilting the scales in a particular direction.
Exactly. They might frame the issues in a way that favors one side, push for solutions that align with their own interests, or even leak information strategically to shape public opinion.
It sounds like navigating these situations requires a whole different level of diplomatic savvy. How can the parties involved even tell if they're being played?
That's a great question, and it highlights the importance of careful analysis and a healthy dose of skepticism. The parties involved need to carefully assess the third party's motivations, track record, and actions throughout the process. Do their proposals consistently favor one side? Are they transparent in their dealings? These are all red flags to watch out for.
It's like being a detective looking for clues. But sometimes, even if a third party has some level of self-interest, their involvement might not be entirely negative, right?
You're absolutely right. Sometimes a third party's existing relationships can actually be an asset, even if they're not perfectly neutral.
Wait, really? I'm curious how that could work.
Well, if a country has strong ties with both sides in a conflict, they might be able to leverage those relationships to build trust and persuade the parties to engage in dialogue.
So it's like having a mediator who speaks both languages, both figuratively and literally.
Exactly. They might have a deeper understanding of the cultural nuances, historical baggage, and underlying interests driving the conflict, allowing them to navigate those complexities more effectively.
I see your point. So it's not always a black and white situation. But doesn't that make it even more crucial for the disputing parties to be aware of these dynamics and to proceed cautiously?
Absolutely. They need to be strategic in their engagement with the third party, carefully weighing the potential benefits and risks. If they decide to proceed, they need to be prepared to advocate for their own interests and ensure their voices are heard.
So it becomes a delicate dance, balancing the need for assistance with the awareness that the third party might not have their best interests at heart.
Precisely. Now let's flip the script for a moment and consider this from the perspective of the disputing parties themselves. What factors might influence their decision to accept good offices, especially when they know the third party might not be completely neutral?
I imagine they'd have to weigh the potential benefits against the risks, right? If a country is facing a dire situation, they might be more willing to accept help from anyone, even if it comes with strings attached.
You're spot on. They might be desperate for any kind of assistance facing military defeat, an economic crisis, or intense international pressure to end the conflict. In those situations, they might be willing to overlook the third party's biases just to get to the negotiation table.
It's a pragmatic calculation. But couldn't it also backfire? What if accepting good offices from a biased third party ends up legitimizing their position or giving them more leverage in the negotiations?
That's a valid concern. It's a risk the disputing parties must carefully consider. They might try to mitigate that risk by setting clear parameters for the good offices process, or by seeking support from other international actors to counterbalance the influence of the potentially biased third party.
So it's not a decision to be taken lightly. It requires strategic thinking and a clear understanding of the potential consequences.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap up our deep dive into good offices, I think it's worth reflecting on the broader significance of this concept. What does it tell us about the nature of international relations and the pursuit of peace in a complex world?
That's a great question. It seems like good offices highlights the importance of dialogue and communication, even when those conversations are difficult or fraught with mistrust.
Exactly. It underscores the idea that even in the midst of conflict, channels of communication should remain open. Diplomacy is often about finding ways to talk to your adversaries, to understand their perspectives, and to explore avenues for peaceful resolution.
And good offices provides a framework for those conversations to happen in a structured and hopefully productive way.
Precisely. It also highlights the role of third parties in international relations. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to break deadlocks and facilitate compromise. And those third parties can come from a variety of sources, from individual states to regional organizations to international institutions.
It's a reminder that there are actors out there who are committed to peace and who are willing to invest time and resources to help resolve conflicts.
Exactly. And finally, I think good offices reminds us that peace is an ongoing process, not a one-time event.
It's not just about signing a treaty or declaring a ceasefire. It's about addressing the root causes of conflict, building trust, and creating the conditions for long-term stability.
Precisely. And that process requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Well said. As we conclude our deep dives into good offices, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with our listeners. It's been a fascinating and insightful journey.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this often overlooked but incredibly important diplomatic tool.
And as you continue your studies, remember the power of dialogue, the importance of third-party intervention, and the complexities of navigating international relations in pursuit of peace.
Because ultimately, the goal is to create a world where good offices are less about resolving conflict and more about preventing it from happening in the first place.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for listening to Lex Talks.
Subscribe and join us again for more explorations into the fascinating world of law.